It's a great pleasure to have Professor James Martell here with us. I know James for a number of years, for decades, in fact, and it's great to continue the work that we started collectively as a group. We had a symposium on modernities and modernisms across the world. Last year in November, had a Gyan course by Professor Jean-Michel Rabate. He gave a talk on total modernisms, which James tells me prompted certain lines of inquiry in his own research. And that has what led to, or at least has been an inspiration behind the formation of this talk. So let me give you a more formal introduction to James before I give it over to him. And again, with due apologies for all these delays. James Martell is Associate Professor of Romance Languages at Lyon College. He co-edited Samuel Beckett and the Encounter of Philosophy and Literature with me. In 2013, with Fernanda Negrete. In 2018, a special volume of Samuel Beckett Today, titled Beckett Beyond Words. And in 2021, Tattooed Bodies, Theorizing Body Inscription Across Disciplines and Cultures, with Erik Larsen. His book, Modernism, Self-Creation and the Maternal, The Mother's Son, Routledge, was published in 2019. And he's currently editing a book on the Marquis de Sade and modernism, working on a short book on Beckett and Derrida for Cambridge Elements, and on a monograph on surfaces of thought in European literature and philosophy. It's wonderful to have you here, James. And I know, if I'm not mistaken, your talk is titled Modernism's Totalities, from the Marquis de Sade to Titus-Carmel. And a very warm welcome. Over to you, James. Thank you.
Thank you, Arka. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Since I won't be controlling the slides, I'll just say next slide when it happens. It's going to be a little often there. But yeah, I want to thank the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, where you guys are at the Indian Institute of Technology at Gandhinagar, and especially to both Angel Maria Varghese and to my friend, Professor Arka Chattopadhyay, for the invitation and for making this event possible. And finally, of course, I would like to thank all of you for coming, those there in the room and those coming through your screens, especially for those for whom this is a very early morning. So thank you so much. So we'll begin. The title of this talk, as you see, Modernism's Totalities, promises you something serious, grave, and heavy, if not the heaviest object of all. It promises not only one totality, but many totalities, a perhaps indefinite plurality of totalities. In a certain way, as you can already infer, such a plurality might already be contradictory, if not aporetic. What do you mean totalities? You could say, isn't there only one totality, one set that includes it all, everything, even itself? Thankfully, this is not a talk on mathematics or on the relations between mathematics and modernism. I leave it to my good friend Arka and other colleagues to spearhead that research. This is a talk just about the totalities, or the totality, if at the end we reckon there is only one, of modernism. Next slide, please. Okay. So given the limited time I have, I will circumscribe myself to only 7 totalities, which, using French idioms that I will explain as I go, I have titled "tout voir one," "tout voir tout," "tout dire," "tout manger one," "tout manger two," "tout être," and finally "tout reflet" ou "tout reflète," "tout penser au fond." So let's begin by looking at the totality that is modernism, or has been. Well, if I have to be honest, I am not sure I can circumscribe this totality either. This is because I'm not exactly sure when modernism began, nor when it ended, or even if it has ended. So if we take a cue from a classic textbook on modernism, like Lawrence Rainey's Modernisms, an anthology from 2005, we can demarcate the beginning of modernism with Marinetti's Futurism Manifesto from 1909, or we could mark its beginning with Ezra Pound, perhaps with his poem In a Station of the Metro from 1913, as my mentor, Maud Ellman, did the first day of her last modernism course at the University of Notre Dame. Next slide, please. So here is the point. In a station of the metro, the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. Since, as we can see, this inaugural poem begins with a quintessentially phenomenological noun, apparition, in the etymological sense of phenomenon as apparition or phainastai, meaning to appear, we can turn now from here to a more visual beginning, and through it to our first totality. This is part of what I would like to call modernism's attempt to tout voir, just as one say in French, tout dire, to see everything or to say everything. As Derrida remarked in an interview with Erik Larsen, tout dire, in French, carries the meaning of totalization, i.e., saying all that can be said, but also of liberation or affranchissement, or in other words, of being able to say anything, notwithstanding censorship, shock, repression, etc. In Derrida's own words, next slide, please. To say everything, or to dire, is no doubt to gather, by translating, all figures into one another, to totalize by formalizing. But to say everything is also to break out of prohibitions, to s'affranchir oneself in every field where law can lay down the law. End of quote. So let us begin then with our first totality, the first visual equivalent of this to dire, to say everything. Tout voir, one. Next slide, please. So this is tout voir, Las Meninas, or the two sovereigns. What would this mean for our modernist phenomenological and visual dimension, what I call tout voir, implying both a gathering, a total recapitulation of presentation and representation, and also the possibility of freeing oneself from any limit or boundary, and thus the possibility of being able to see and make everybody see everything. Such a possibility of considering the beginning of modernism through the visual was given to us by Foucault, as you well know, at the outset of The Order of Things, or Le Mots et les Choses, where he analyzes Velázquez's 17th century painting, Las Meninas. As we know, Foucault's analysis of this painting focuses on the spatial and semiological relations between the painted painter, Velázquez himself, there, the main subject of the composition, La Infanta, there too, the represented painting, on the left you can see it, it's back to us, and the mirror in the background, reflecting the sovereigns, Philip IV and his wife, Mariana of Austria. If Foucault considers this painting to be, as it were, the manifest essence, that's his words, of all representations, it is because in it we see the relation between the two solidary invisibilities of a classic representation. Number one, the deep invisibility of what one sees, and two, the invisibility of the one who sees, or of the model and its sovereign, or even of the giving author and the one to whom one gives the representation as a gift. According to Foucault, if Las Meninas makes visible the essential relation between these two sovereign subjects of representation, it is because, by making visible their solidary invisibilities, it interrupts the relation. Or rather, it shows, fait voir, makes see, how such a relation can never be present without residuum, remains, or rest. In Foucault's own words, I quote, "It is not possible for the pure felicity of the image ever to present in a full light both the master who is representing and the sovereign who is being represented." End of quote. Now, if Foucault designates this painting as the paradigmatic example of representation, or the apparition of representation's essence, and together with Cervantes' Don Quixote, as an inaugurating example of the modern artwork, it is precisely because of its totalizing impulse and structure. In other words, if Las Meninas presents us with a representation of representation, and/or with a definition of the space opened by representation, it is because of its totalizing attempt to voir, that is to say, to see everything, to include all things in this sight, as well as to break free from all obstacles to visibility or causes for blindness. As Foucault says, and I quote, "Representation undertakes to represent itself here in all its elements, with its images, the eyes to which it is offered, the faces it makes visible, the gestures that call it into being, end of quote. And this includes, as you can see there on the bottom right, the dog looking away. As he describes it, this totalizing visual impulse is essentially, and thus necessarily, thwarted by an invisibility inherent in the relational structure of representation, whereupon the two sovereigns, author and model, author and observer, or giver and receiver, can never be fully present without rest. As a consequence, one could say that the totalizing impulse is also germane to this essential invisibility, since the latter rises out of every single corner. In Foucault's words, quote, in the midst of this dispersion, which it is simultaneously grouping together and spreading out, tout ensemble, before us, indicating compellingly from every side, the toute part is an essential void, the necessary disappearance of that which is its foundation, of the person it resembles and the person in whose eyes it is only a resemblance, end of quote. In this way, the two subjects, which constitute the foundation, or that which founds representation, ce qui la fonde, writes Foucault, these two subjects disappear in and perhaps as the background, le fond in French. These two subjects are, alternatively, the author, painter, or donor of the painting, and the model, sovereign, or receiver of the artwork, as homage or offering. By calling them alternatively master, model, and sovereign, Foucault underlines both the necessity of the duality or rapport as well as its instability. However, while in Foucault's description, most of the time these positions are occupied by the painter and the king, there is one instance where two sovereigns, les souverains, designate not the two men, representer and representee, but the man and woman or sovereign couple reflected in the background, Philippe V and Mariana of Austria. In other words, here, the sovereigns are the founders, thus, not only of the representational relation, but also of the economical, political, social, and in some way, natural, biological relation of the realm. Given the queen's disappearance in most of Foucault's description, we shall go back to her as a quintessential sovereign subject before the end of this talk. Next section, to voir, the flesh, la mort de Marat. Next slide, please. Since we have been talking about the appearance and disappearance of sovereigns in general, I want to present to you another visual potential beginning to modernism, or with another version of what I call to voir, our second totality, Jacques-Louis David's The Death of Marat. We know the story. Jean-Paul Marat, key figure of the French Revolution, was assassinated on July 13, 1793, with a knife by a young woman, Charlotte Corday. A day before, he had been visited by some Jacobin deputies, among which the painter himself, Jacques-Louis David. Shortly after the assassination, charged by the deputy Guiraud, David painted the portrait, just as he had done for Le Pelletier de Saint-Fargeau, and presented it to the convention on November 14, 1793. As you can see, the painting tries to portray Marat as a full martyr of the revolution, killed at the moment of trying to help the young girl who ended up becoming his murderer, set in a position reminiscent of a Christ descended from the cross, with also a Christ-like wound on the chest, the riding feather still erecting the hand, his body semi-wrapped in white cloth, symbolizing his ideological purity, etc., etc. Needless to say, this was not at the time an already recognized martyr or a member of a settled hagiology or hagiography. Finished just a couple of months after Marat's death, the painting tried to make a revolutionary hero out of a liminal political figure, considered alternatively as a villain or hero by the undecided people of the changing regimes. According to Timothy J. Clark, it is this undecidability with regard not only to Marat, but also to the revolution at large, and the way David tried to ingest it, this undecidability, in and with the painting, that makes it an inaugural pictorial moment of modernism. In his own words of Clark, quote, Marat could not be made to embody the revolution because no one agreed about what the revolution was. Least of all about whether Marat was its Jesus or its Lucifer. David's picture, this is what makes it inaugural of modernism, tries to ingest this disagreement and make it a part of a new cult object, end of quote. As Clarke explains, however, the attempt at this ingestion of the conflict takes place not exactly through the hagiographic and heroic traits of the representation of Marat, but rather at the place without place, or the space without assignation in the painting, namely on its upper half that you have there on your right. Here, we do not have so much a representation, quote from Clarke, of nothing or nothing much, of an absence in which whatever the subject is has become present, but something more like, as with Foucault-Menina, Saad, something more like a representation of painting as pure activity, painting as material, therefore, aimless, in the end, detached from any one representational task, bodily, end of quote. Here is where we see that the art of painting as such, pre- and post-revolution, has never been completely detached from the sovereign, nor from the embodied idea of a sovereign. As Erik Larsen demonstrates in a continuation of Clarke's reading of David's painting, the modernist instability of the death of Marat takes place precisely as a double or reflection of another death, the death of the ultimate sovereign subject, the total representative of all subjects, the king. According to Sadner, if David was trying to depict Marat as a martyr, if not to deify him, as he has tried to do before with other figures of revolution like Michel Le Pelletier and Joseph Barrat, and if such an action helps, if not constitutes a modern and modernist gesture, it is because it is an attempt to, in Sadner's words, give new flesh to all subjects, bereft as they were then of the divine flesh of the king. And I quote Sadner, "The task was to put forth a body that would, as it were, incarnate the now empty place of the king, the figure that had traditionally been charged with corporeally representing the subject for all other subjects of the realm. The task would be, in a word, to incarnate in some ostensibly new way the excarnated principle of sovereignty." End of quote. In this way, following Sadner, if modernism is intrinsically linked to modernity and the modern subject, this is because it has to represent or, quote, model the dimension of the flesh that is exacerbated to an unbearable degree by the representational deadlock situated at the transition from royal to popular sovereignty, end of quote. If this flesh must appear in such an abstract fashion at the upper half of David's painting, it is because, deprived of kingly and divine transcendence, the inflamed materiality of all subjects becomes purely immanent. In other words, like Freud said of the psyche in one of its last notes, it is all spread out, ausgedehnt. In this pure spread out immanence, there is no longer a contest or rapport of or between two totalities, an author and a subject, a painter and a model, etc., producing some hidden rest, a queen that disappears, or a dog that ignores the painting. Here, there is rather pure rest or pure remains, a Hegelian or Beckettian desert, without a totalizing operation deducting or deducing them. Without such a deduction, the modern and modernist question for the artist then becomes, can such remains be said or written? Here is our third totality, to-dire. Next slide, please. To-dire Saad. As Jean-Michel Rabaté reminds us in his recent book, Beckett and Saad, Saad's motto was, il faut tout dire, which we can translate as, one must say it all, everything must be said, or one must be able to say everything, notwithstanding any repression, censorship, limit, and so on. Going back to the historical political context of modernism we're investigating, a couple of years before Marat was assassinated and the inaugural modernist painting of David was produced, on July 2nd, 1789, Saad gave us a paradigmatic example of to-dire when he yelled out of his window at the Bastille that the prisoners were being killed. 2 days later, he was transferred to the insane asylum at Charenton, just 10 days before the storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, the inaugural event of the French Revolution, according to official history. A modern historical event for which Saad's cries might have been part of its material cause. As we know, Sade's oeuvre is the quintessential example of the double meaning of the expression to dire. That is to say, it is both one, a totalizing attempt to exhaust all that which is sayable in an almost more geometrical catalog-like work, Pacy Spinoza, that includes within its limits every possible thing, and two, an all-liberating impulse to affranchise oneself from any limit, coercion, obstacle, censorship, etc. In other words, to have the right to say anything one desires. Consequently, Sade's influence on modernism and modernist writers lies precisely in such a struggle for absolute freedom of expression, but also in his totalitarian desire for totalization, and with it, for the exhaustion of life and perhaps more, like the attempt of some of his sadists to make their victims condemn themselves through sacrilege, for example, and for eternity. Both impulses, to say it all, exhausting all there is to say, and to break with any limit in front of the sayable, point to the new kind of popular or kingless sovereignty described above in the context of Jacques-Louis David's picture. In other words, if there is no more king, as well as no more God, no more father, priest, aristocracy, etc., there is nothing sacred or transcendent that could escape a full catalog of reality, or following the etymology of catalog, a counting or writing down of all there is. At the same time, whoever speaks has the right, as a paradoxically absolute sovereign in this purely immanent world, to say anything they desire to say. As Annie Lebrun points out, the consequence of this realization of the pure immanence of the cosmos, where I, my own self, and my interiority am made of the same undistinguishable matter of the mountains, insects, stars, and so on, is both monstrous and banal, humiliating and liberating. Quote, nothing is more monstrous, one would agree, because humanity, by this token, finds itself confounded with a possible form of energy, since man becomes a probability of being just like any other. But also, simultaneously, nothing is more banal. Even if we have forgotten about it, what childhood was not haunted by the violent desire of a physical sovereignty at the scale of the universe? End of quote from Lebrun. Now, in this pure indistinguishableness of energy or matter, what Beckett would call the mud, la boue, and Jean-Michel Rabaté recently described as Beckett's excremental pantheism, or Deus sive natura sive merda, where there are no essential limits nor angles to determine an elevated perspective, how could any sovereign or sovereignty appear? That is to say, etymologically, how could anything or anybody rise itself above, supra, this materialistically homogeneous surface? And on the other hand, if everything is leveled here, what happens with what potentially or even necessarily must go not above, as in a censure or assumption, but under? What happens with the excremental rest that must necessarily fall? How could one distinguish it enough to be able to separate it, say it, and to say that this is excrement? So we move on to our fourth totality. Next slide, please. To manger one, to eat it all, or all you must eat. Anybody who has read The 120 Days of Sodom knows that this book is full of rests, residuum, and excremental remains, especially but not exclusively human. Not only is it full of it, but it seems that said excremental remains are sometimes the main object of the story, an object not to be, as usually in our modern world, discarded, dropped, erased, and passed in silence, but rather to be cherished, treasured, and yes, mostly and eagerly consumed. In other words, in this particular writerly attempt to say it all, to dire, it is as if to say is to eat. And this coprophagous logic of a logos that eats itself, like an Ouroboros, like the one we have in the screen, this logic underscores a constant assimilation in Sade's book and oeuvre of sexual and culinary pleasures. This is the logic of an infinite consumption without rest, driven by a principle declared at the beginning of the 21st day. Quote, there is a proverb, and proverbs are a really good thing, that stipulates that appetite comes by eating, end of quote. In other words, begin eating and you will never stop eating again, especially your own residues. As perhaps one would expect if one is familiar with deconstruction, it is this infinite coprophagous logic that caught Derrida's attention in his most serious engagement with Sade's oeuvre, a short analysis that takes place in a couple of lines in Cartouche, a text dedicated to Titus-Carmel's work, the pocket-sized clinged coffin. In this text appears what, besides a quotation of Sade's famous will in Aporie, mentioned too in Cartouche, and dealing also with rests, but in this case Sade's own, here appears what I believe is Derrida's only direct quote of the Marquis de Sade, a quote precisely from the 120 Days. This quote of a tale by La Duclos includes the following description, and I quote, "One cannot imagine, gentlemen, to what point men carry their madness in the fire of their imagination. Did I not see one who, still within the same principles, would demand that I thrash him heartily on the buttocks without a cane until he had eaten the third, étron? He will have drawn before him from the very bottom of the place's cesspit, fosse de lieu in French. And his perfidious discharge will spurt into my mouth at this dispatch only when he had devoured this impure mire, fange impure in French." End of quote. Immediately after this quote, Derrida remarks, quote, "Draw then again before oneself from the very bottom, fond même, of the place's cesspit, fosse de lieu, once un coup, which means also one blow, then again and again, extract the remainder, le reste, and make it one's own, se l'approprier in French, to appropriate it." This is the totalizing gesture of tout manger, eating it all in order to appropriate it, to make it, every little thing, one's own, exhausting all that is other, and ultimately the world, if not the universe. And following the second sense of tout manger, the affranchising one, it is also the desire to break any and all limits to what one can eat. Going back a little in Derrida's text, when he had first analogized Sade's 120 Days with the 127 coffins of Titus-Carmel's artwork, he remarked, quote, "To take on, assumer, anal excretion, swallow it or have it swallowed, to reckon, escompter, on its enjoyment, jouissance, such was the rhythmic operation, the regular cadence of the 120 days," end of quote. We must ask ourselves now, how is the reckoning or the counting, since Derrida uses the verb escompter, which always includes the count, like the compte, how is the measuring of this enjoyment of infinite consumption of all rests possible? In other words, what is its ratio, value, measure, or parameter? With this question, we move on, thus, to our next totality. Next slide, please. Tout manger tout, or eating the infinite. In 1959, the Italian artist Piero Manzoni did a series of works called Le Linee, or the lines, consisting of small black cylinders containing scrolls of paper with lines that went up to 7,200 meters long. A year later, he did a new series, this time called Lines of Infinite Length. What he had warned already with the first series, in all caps in a letter to a contact in Germany, that under no circumstance the cylinders should be opened, he underlined this again to a reporter with regard to the Infinite Line series. Quote, "Recently, I executed a line of infinite length, but this also has its defect. You must keep the case perfectly closed because if you open it, the line will disappear," end of quote. Around the same time, he developed an analog artwork to this infinite line that also it was better to keep closed. This new artwork, contained this time in a can, was called Merda d'Artista, or Artist's Shit. Allegedly containing the described product, 30 grams of human feces, Manzoni had initially set its value by equating it with gold. While at the beginning, as you can imagine, it was difficult to sell them at this price, with time they have reached an exorbitant value, with the record being so far 275,000 euros at an art auction in Milan in 2016. A price still perhaps far away from the infinite value of the line. However, Both artworks were, not only due to their temporal coincidence, but also due to its meaning, linked in Manzoni's mind. They were both part of an attempt to not only monetize, but also to measure an artist's conceptual or bodily idiom. In his own words, quote, "I should like all artists to sell their fingerprints, or else stage competitions to see who can draw the longest line or sell their shed in tints," end of quote. Capturing the infinite, either by measurement or by giving absolute value to the rests that are usually discarded, is thus a way of tout manger, of eating or assimilating it all, at least in a can, if not for eternity, perhaps for 100 years or so. But what about all the other human rests, the ultimate ones, those that we live, let fall when we die? If Derrida linked Saad's 120 days to Titus-Carmel's artwork, since Titus-Carmel had already done it with the apparently arbitrary choice of the quantity of reproductions, 127 instead of 120, this is because the third, étron, as a separation of the human body, can be analogized as well with a coffin, the recipient where we lay to rest the ultimate separation of ourselves. But why 127 coffins, that is to say, 127 separations, and of what exact totality of self? This brings us to our next totality, still in line with the double meaning of tout dire. And next slide, please. Tout être, or to be and exhaust it all. In this artwork by Titus-Carmel, the pocket-sized tlingit coffin, what is the main self, the principles or paradigm from which the other 127 reproductions separate themselves? And that is the main point of the artwork. If you don't know it, is Titus-Carmel had that little coffin from the Tlingit people, and then he created 127. The main self, the principles or paradigm, is Derrida's main question at the threshold of his text, Cartouche. And when he designates this first one, opening the can of worms, pun intended, of the question of the sovereign. At the same time, he knows that this question of the sovereign as the first subject, involving the necessity of a line or lineage, is also always the question of the rest remains resident. Consequently, he begins this text, Cartouche, after marking the date, November 30, 1977, with the unfinished line, quote, "And so for the rest, without precedents," end of quote. 2 pages afterwards, he includes a photograph of the real model, that's the photograph you see on your left, on the hand of the author, real, model, and author, all terms independently suspended with quotation marks by Derrida. And then he quotes Titus-Carmel's own definition of the Tlingit coffin, included in the short book that accompanied the exhibition. I quote this definition: "A mahogany box of modest dimensions, 10 by 6.2 by 2.4 centimeters. Its making was carefully thought out. The choice of the wood, the tint, the arrangements of the strings, the assemblage, dovetailing, the proportions, the golden mean, etc. The bottom of the box is covered with a mirror, and at each end, 2 counterforts are placed as supports for a reed oval, the 2 sides of which are wrapped in gray synthetic fur. Furthermore, the oval is held in place by a lacing whose ties pass through the sides of the box at 6 different points, and then knotted around a sort of key hang freely about the small wooden coffin. A thin sheet of plastic attached by 4-minute brass screws encloses the hole," end of quote. Shortly after this description, Derrida gives at the next date or diary entry, since Cartouche is written like that, a mot d'ordre or watchword, quote, "It will have been necessary to get down to it," as Bennington, end of quote, as Bennington and MacLeod translated, or in the French original, "Il aura fallu s'y mettre," and in my own translation, "It will have been necessary to put or get oneself there, inside." Derrida then elaborates on the difficulties, not so much to translate the expression s'y mettre to another language, but rather to understand it in the original French. Quote, "Get down to it, s'y mettre. Not only begin, undertake a piece of work, se mettre à l'œuvre, get working or commit oneself, give some commitment, donner du gage, or also give a token, wages, a guarantee, proof, evidence, a wager even, but also put oneself in, se mettre dans, spread oneself out, lie down with slow gestures, sometimes impatient or discouraged, exalted or depressed, 127 times, plus one or without the other, in a coffin which one has built for oneself or for the other, each time, à chaque coup, for the first and last time, at the article of death, but without excluding another time, always the first and the last. Derrida calls these coffins cenotaphs, pointing out the etymological meaning of the Greek word kenostaphos, kenotaphion, which expresses an emptiness, kenos, or act of emptying. Then he affirms, almost as a death sentence, in a single-line paragraph, quote, disappeared is the subject, end of quote. However, in the next paragraph, he makes an exception, clarifying that if the caskets or coffrets are empty, it is only of the proper body. There remain reliefs, relics, leftovers, a ring, some threads, or children, we could say, since in French the word is fil, some children or threads gather around an empty place, a foyer, says Titus-Carmel, and above all, surtout, this mirror right at the bottom, tout au fond. You can barely see it there in the illustration, in the photograph. So let's pause here and observe, just as we did in Las Meninas, this fond or background, where the sovereign subject, the princeps or prince, has disappeared as well. So let's move in this pause to our last totality. Please, next slide. Tout reflet ou tout reflète, tout penser au fond, to reflect all reflections, to think it all at the bottom. There, in both paintings or artworks, at the bottom or background, since fond means both terms, depending on how many dimensions we're considering, there remains a mirror reflecting what or who remains, which, when we look at it logically, it always ends up being us, the disappearing subject, or subjects, since although the king or prince has disappeared from our Republican politico-historical context, he's always there in our discourse about his disappearance or beheading, be it as a salutation of good riddance or as a nostalgic remorse. In our ongoing modernity, as we know, his rests sometimes, indeed, without precedent, as Derrida said, remain. As we saw in Foucault's description of Las Meninas, the king's rests remain unlike those of Marino of Austria, the other sovereign, who got swallowed and assimilated by and to the painter or main representer, Velázquez, the maker, the creator, the artist, the giver, i.e., to the other sovereign of this tableau, who attempts to complete the impossible rapport of a full representation. In a similar way, the female body of David's The Death of Marat has disappeared, or almost. At least her name remains as an answer plea in the letter still being held by the dying hand of the murdered martyr. Quote from that letter that you can see in the painting. Marie Anne Charlotte Corday to the citizen Marat. All that is needed to have your hospitality is that I am truly unfortunate, malheureuse. End of quote. However, as the confusion and possibilities of the revolution, together with the flesh described by Sandner and painted by David, began to settle, to take different forms and figures, Charlotte Corday started appearing again. Next slide, please. Throughout the 19th century, she was depicted in paintings by Baudelaire, Jean-Joseph Vers, and even a Mexican artist, Santiago Ribul, among others. Alternatively defiant, scared, alone in the room with the dead or still dying body of Marat, or threatened by the accusing mass of revolutionaries, bursting in both shock and fury, her delimited figure absorbs, pulling towards her face, her eyes, her hand, or the knife, the indefinite plastic flesh of a yet nascent sovereignty. Now, notwithstanding the abyssal historical and sociopolitical differences, the attempt to figure her and her relation not only to the dead hero, but also to the revolution and the constitution of the new French sovereignty at large, reminds me of the contemporary attempts to figure and thus delimit the young activist Greta Thunberg. Next slide, please. For example, considering her recent interaction with the former kickboxer and self-defined misogynist Andrew Tate, where she emasculated him in a tweet, in response to his taunting her about the amount of pollution his 33 cars emit, which actually might have ultimately triggered his arrest days later, I wonder about how we're trying to figure her actions. As we know, while for perhaps most of us, she appears as a young hero fighting for the planet and for a more just world. For others, she's a self-aggrandizing, hypocritical villain, only seeking attention, etc., etc., etc. In other words, while Marat was not necessarily an advocate for the restitution of masculinity and the subjugation of women, nor Andrew Tate, a real revolutionary figure at the center of lethal political forces trying to found a republic, I cannot help but seeing in the reactions to the literal and figural assassination of both men a grappling with the inherent violence of sovereign gestures, as they have been represented in our cultures always in and through masculinity. As we well know, such an identification of the sovereign subject and its representation with the masculine figure, king, father, son, is an essential part of our modern and modernist tradition. Through this identification of the sovereign, its representation and man, any conception of totality is already determined, as Lacan well saw, by the phallus as signifier, making of the feminine position the non-totality or patou, patut. Now, how is it that this feminine on-totality has taken its place in and as modernism? Or at least, what is its role? Or in other words, what happened with her reflection in modernist works, or with the other, the left side of the mirror in the background, as in Velázquez's painting? Where fits the queen in this modernist story? Not only Marina or Marie Antoinette, but also Charlotte Corday, as she sovereignly took in her hands the right of exception by killing Marat, and with her all the disappearing women of the courts and the revolution, including those of Saad, and not only by this I mean his victim and heroine doublet, Justine and Juliette, or his infamous storytellers, La Duclos, La Chambille, La Martell, La Desgrange, etc., but also all the nameless bodies whose only role sometimes in these texts and artworks is to serve as the surface of suffering for the totalitarian subjects. In other words, where do all these feminine bodies, conditions of not only possibility, but also of marking an expression, as so many choras or subjectiles preparing the ground for any creation, where do they all fit or take place, since they seem to be the place of appearance of desire itself, e.g., Molly Bloom and Olivia Purabelle, Tiamat, or the floating sirens seducing Achilles, but also Kafka, Blanchot, Rabaté, myself, etc., through both their music and silence. To end, I want to go back to the bottom of the pocket coffin. Next slide, please. As Derrida explained, the proper body has disappeared from the princeps coffin, just as the king's body has allegedly disappeared from our theopolitical landscape, leaving just his remains, relics, etc., of which, most importantly, a mirror to reflect our sovereign self, albeit already dead, when we look down into it at the bottom. But that is the first princeps royal coffin with its disappeared body. But what about the bodies of the other coffins? What if, notwithstanding their ontological status as drawings or bidimensional reproductions, the 127 coffins were so many containers for other proper bodies, fit as well with mirrors to allow for 127 reflections, and thus to trigger our empathy while simultaneously making us see our complicity in some of their deaths and suffering? What will there be at the bottom of these reproductions, bereft too of their proper bodies, but not of their remains, including some threads or sons, fils, fil, as well as a mirror at the bottom, or rather as the bottom or background? My final hypothesis is that at the bottom of at least one of those coffins, we will find a bottom or background created between 1946 and 1966. A font that we can still visit these days at the Philadelphia Museum of Art in the hall dedicated to Marcel Duchamp. Next slide, please. This bottom is his last work, Étant donné. There, as we know, if we enter the small room, approach the door, and carefully look in through the two halls, marked by the facial oils of so many visitors, probably so many already dead, there we acquire a particular point of view where we can see everything. Or, as Jean-Michel Rabaté says, tout est devenu visible. Everything has become visible. Here, in my hypothesis, there is a point of view of the totality, or rather of our totalities, similar to the one described by Derrida at the end of Cogito and the History of Madness. This absolute point of view is similar to the point we saw in David's The Death of Marat and in Velázquez's Las Meninas, in the sense that it shows us the eruption of pure pictoriality in pure materiality, either through an empty space or through the parallax between two disappearing and confused sets of subjects, the sovereign couple and the painter and model. However, here the female body does not disappear. Instead, it is displayed in its totality and as the totality of what is given, étant donné. If we cannot see it completely, her head is beyond our sight, it is perhaps because, as Derrida said of his approach to Titus-Carmel's coffins, it will be necessary to get in there, s'y mettre. Nevertheless, in our questioning of the reality or rationality of what we see there, a naked female body lying on some branches holding a lamp, not unlike the death-dying Marat holding the letter, in front of a mystic landscape with a moving cascade in the background. In front of this, the contradictions that could arise out of the situation are irrelevant. Given this female body and the light in her hands, we are given the totality of what could not only be painted or sculpted, but also thought. In other words, we are given, donné, the background of the desire and anguish that have come to create what we call modernism. Here, where we are outside of this totality. We must be in order to be able to describe it. In other words, we are exceeding it. Consequently, here, outside of totality, we must be placed either in infinity or in nothingness. This is our modern and modernist point of view, the point of view of totality. As Derrida explains, quote, invulnerable to all determined opposition between reason and unreason, it is the point starting from which the history of the determined forms of this opposition, this opened or broken off dialogue, can appear as such and be stated. It is the impenetrable point of certainty in which the possibility of Foucault's narration, as well as of the narration of the totality, or rather of all the determined forms of the exchanges between reason and madness, are embedded. It is the point at which the project of thinking this totality by escaping it is embedded. By escaping it, that is to say, by exceeding the totality, which, within existence, is possible only in the direction of infinity or nothingness. End of quote. Such an escape from totality as a self-positioning in infinity or nothingness is, as we can infer, necessarily violent. This is the violence of thought, writing, and a modern work of art. In order to create a totality, to make any work of art, faire œuvre, not necessarily a Gesamtkunstwerk, we must cut, mutilate, sometimes even decapitate, but at the end, always extirpate ourselves into infinity or nothingness, demanding a sovereignty beyond calculation. Unless there is another possibility of modernism, and with it, for the violence of the work as well. Next slide, and that's the end. Thank you.
You're done, James, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for that very wonderful, complex, layered talk about totality, infinity, the relationship between the two, if I may say, the paradox of totality as totality of freedom on the one hand, but then also totalitarianism on the other hand, and how modernism kind of navigates this space. And it was wonderful the way you showed us all these different variations about totality vis-a-vis infinity, the ideas of eating, being, and all these forms of exhaustion. Uh, I mean, if I may just take the advantage of opening the set of questions with a very quick question, maybe if you would like to tell us a little bit more about how this notion of totality in relation to modernism might complicate the idea of incompleteness, which is something that we often associate with modernist art, whether it is through ambivalence or through the interpretive inexhaustibility of modernist art and literature. I'm wondering whether in a certain way this idea of totality and totalization in modernism creates a kind of different accent vis-a-vis that sort of critical commonplace of the modernist text being incomplete, ambivalent, and all of that? It's a very basic question. I'm sorry. I'm just trying to think here. Yeah.
No, thank you so much, Orko. It's not basic, basic at all. I think it's one of the main questions, and I think maybe what has happened is that, you know, like one of the main narratives of modernism that we have has been determined, at least in French studies, by Nancy and Lacoue-Labarthe, like the literary absolute, making the connections between romanticism and modernism, right? And in that sense, exactly, like we get, you know, more of an accent on the fragment, right, the incomplete, and I think it's part of the same problem, right? Is the idea of there is an incompleteness precisely because technically there should be a possibility of completeness and totality, right? What I'm interested in, right, more and more these days, and this is a lot through, as you can tell, Jean-Michel's own work, is how does this incompleteness and completeness, or this attempt to totalize oneself or to fulfill oneself, to fill the lack, if you will, how is it related to two things? One, to the political landscape, changing from the revolution up to romanticism and the 20th century, and two, through gender, right? Like the changing gender roles that we have through the 19th century, right? Especially the marking of the masculine gender, right? So and especially when we think about like the, you know, the high modernist artworks like Ulysses, Finnegan's Wake, T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland, and so on, that are so much embedded into this traumatized masculinity, right? Like Molly Bloom's beautiful monologue of Ulysses, right? It's this fantastic book that we all love, right? But there is this, you know, in that dissolution of her voice and so on, there is this still the affirmation of Leopold being a cuckold, right? And then in order to kind of save that lack or that, like, you know, a front towards masculinity, you have the reaffirmation of love at the end in some way, right? So I think it's, yeah, like to answer it in a basic way, like I think it's just the same paradigm, if you will, right? Like the incompleteness of modernism is still this dreamt of nostalgia and manipulation in some way of the completeness that, like, allegedly we had in a pre-modernist era, right? Like via religious transcendence, political transcendence, right? Like the flesh, as Sandner remarks, right? Like the idea that we had the two bodies of the king were working well at the end, right? And creating some kind of wholeness, right? So yeah, I think in some way, like it plays with each other, and yeah, I just see them as just the two parts of the same puzzle, if you will. Thank you for the question.
Wonderful. So I'll not take more time and maybe ask the online and the offline audience if they have questions. I think they can all unmute themselves or write it in the chat box, whichever you prefer. If there's questions from the floor here, we're happy to take them. Yeah, there's a question from the audience. I think, Prashant, you can. We'll just give you a microphone. Just give it a second.
Yeah, hello. Am I audible? All right, all right. So my question is regarding this contradiction that we see in.
Oh, it muted. I cannot hear. I cannot hear you. I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Am I audible now?
Yes.
All right. So there is this contradiction that I see in this concept of totality, as in there is being suffering before totality. Let me build on that. What do I mean by that? So here I am borrowing this from Kierkegaard and a bit from Borges. So you see in the library of Bible, there is a complete library, as in it exhausts all the possibilities, right? And before that totality, individuals, as in librarians, suffer. They are exhausted by this totality. But then at the same time, we have, Sadian heroes who try to, exhaust the objects, as in, they try to totalize, or they become total subjects and try to nullify the objects. But interestingly, there is this third thread that I find in Martin Buber's I and Thou. And perhaps here comes the major contradiction. So he talks about something called communitatis, as in a total community. And here we do not see the subversion of the otherness of the other, but the creation of a total community where, self becomes a very ethical category, as in there is respect for every single being in the universe. So this is absolute ethics. Of course, about this even Kierkegaard talks about to certain extents. So I was just pointing out this contradiction between this totalistic aspect that goes into totalitarianism and total ethics. Could you please reflect on that? Thank you.
Thank you. That is a fantastic question. I think that is precisely the issue that we, when you talk about community, right? Like, and I like that you bring Borges' Library of Babel, because it's kind of in the back of what I'm thinking here as well, being also in the back of the Derrida's on reflections on this, right? Because the idea is like, how do you create an ethical commitment, right, or an ethical engagement with the other through this an attempt to create a set, right? Like either a total set or a limited set, right? And I think Derrida will say, you need to respect difference. You need to respect the other and the other's difference, right? The problem here is assimilation. That is the part of the tout manger or eating it all, right? Like Saad's totalitarian dictators, right? Like they are precisely the attempt to destroy any kind of difference. So that's why they are like this the most obscene affirmation of sovereignty, right? Like I am going to completely destroy the other, right? Not only that, but I'm going to make the other eat myself as well, right? And I'm going to eat the other. There's an assimilation that is voracious, right? And that, for example, if you say have a community of artists, you come, right? Like say I start a community of artists and you want to come and join us, right? And you're like, okay, I'm going to do a sculpture. And I'm like, no, you're not. You're going to do painting, right? Like I'm already trying to assimilate you, right? I'm trying to make your otherness part of my my sameness, right? And I think that is the part of when we talk about Borges and we talk about Derrida, you're talking more about the archive, right? And that's what I was talking about, cataloging, right? Like if I create a catalog of things, a total catalog of things, right? I'm already like that gesture for Derrida, and I guess for Borges in some way too, it's always violent, right? Because I'm setting down something and saying how it is, right? Which makes it that I'm stopping the change, if you will, right? And that's why I think for Borges, even though I need to go back to reflect on this, and thank you for this question in that sense, but I think for Borges, that's why Derrida will say the exit of this totality is the infinity, right? So the Aleph, right? So in order to be able to see it and to totalize it, you go into infinity, right? And I think, not thinking so much about Buber, but thinking about Levinas, what they will do is rather see this infinity in the other, right? So like the face of the other, right? What creates anguishness is kind of that infinity within the other that for Derrida will be precisely, right? Like this untotalizable, unassimilable, if you will, right? Kernel. And I think that's what we think about to think about in modernism, right? Like how many works of art, right? Like are exposing this rest. That's the remain. And how many times that was very violent, and it's still very violent. And I think that's what Duchamp does great in a very violent way with Étant donné by giving us like that kernel of desire there. But that's a great, that's a great question. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Any other questions from online or offline? Maybe others are still formulating the question. Let me take this opportunity to ask a very quick question. James, would you like to tell us a little bit more about the relation between totality and the trace, or the idea of the remainder, more than the trace, in fact, the idea of the remainder? I was wondering, could there be an exhaustion without totalization? I mean, because I'm trying to sort of look at the different ways in which psychoanalytic sense of obsession at this point. I was looking at this particular comment of Lacan's, I think in Upir, where he talks about exhaustion that falls short of totalization. So it's an exhaustion that fails to produce the total in that sense. But that's a different story. I'm just generally interested in, because I was thinking about the artworks that you showed us, right? I mean, for the Duchamp work, I guess, again, there's a very interesting use of a very limited vantage point to have a vision of totality. In the, I think it was the Titus-Carmel work, right? Where there is a certain idea of reproduction. And again, I'm wondering whether totality is immune to the idea of copying or reproduction, or is totality reproducible? And if it is reproducible, does it remain a totality? That's a question I have. Sorry, it's a slightly complex question because I'm still trying to think it through. It may not be very, I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, fantastic, Orko. It's a fantastic question. Thank you. And you actually, it's related exactly with what is, or what was working me through this when I was writing this talk. So first, like, I think when you were talking about more like totality and the trace, right? Like, I think, and this is something I take completely from Jean-Michel, beautiful book on Duchamp, when he talks about kind of the paradigms at the beginning of that which resists totality, if you will, or that which complicates our kind of like wholesome or wholeness of modernism, right? So he talks about Benjamin's aura, right? He talks about the sublime, right? Kant's sublime and so on. And then he talks about the uncanny, that's unheimlich, right? As kind of like the ways of this having a certain transcendence or a certain short circuit that troubles, right, our total comprehensiveness of the world or of ourselves and so on, right? So I think that's where I will take the idea of totality and trace, right? Like, I think the idea of like there is, the question is a trace of what, right? So in the sublime, there is a trace of the incomprehensible or of the an sich, right? Like in itself, the noumena and so on, right? In the unheimliche, is there a trace of like, you know, the familiar, that thing that is more us than ourselves, right? That we cannot totalize. And then in the aura, right? Like, which is the aura that Benjamin exactly goes to your point, right? Because there's a trace of the unrepeatable, right? Like with Derrida, we seek more into the idiom, right? Like, because no, like ideally, that is the problem, right? Like there is no, if you have a totality, and that was how kind of started the talk a little bit, right? Like there's one totality. Like the idea of the total is precisely that it cannot be challenged by any other repetition, right? Like that is kind of Foucault's own reading of Las Meninas, is that it fails because you have these two invisibilities of the subject that is trying to capture everything, the painter, right? And then that everything itself that is supposed to be everything and has to be captured, right? So I do think like in that sense, there is, totality is always kind of struggling with repetition, right? Like, and especially in our, or in the modern era, when we talk about the modernism in the 20th century, instead of in the 18th or 19th century, right? I think that is kind of, you know, the main problem. That's what we get with like later with a notion like ontology by Derrida, that Jean-Michel already was working on it, right? And that we see a specter, especially in specters of Marx, right? When you have this idea of how much of Marx's own total dream of the dictatorship of the proletariat, right, is haunted still by idealistic, if you will, notion, right? Like, that creates like exactly this, you know, you see it right now in very like silly discourses about communism, when the regular reaction of people, but when you say like, you know, communism is a dream that is still alive, the regular reaction is like, we had tried it before, it has happened, right? And it's like, no, it's not, like it won't be a repetition, right? Like, but it's this dream again, like that is the messianism of again a totality, or otherwise it wouldn't work. Right. So I think it's a great point there. I see another question too there. I don't know how much time we have, so maybe we should move on to that one.
Right. Right. Yeah, I think it's good to go to the online question. There's a question from Aditi. Aditi is in Isaac Bhopal. She's a Badu scholar. In fact, she's writing in the same book that we are all trying to get together on Badu. So let me just read out Aditi's question for the reference of the offline audience here. I had a question she asks about periodization. If modernism is to see, hear, eat, exhaust, reflect, etc., all, then is there anything that can be pre-modern? Hasn't this been the gesture of cultural maturity at any point in history? I was wondering whether the periodization you propose is based on the relation of totality to immanence, i.e. is modernity the desire for an immanent totalization? But then I gathered that the feminine is internally excluded to complete the phallic totalization. Then would an immanent detotalization be a feminine modernity? Or is your argument that this would be a post-modernity?
Oh, that's a great question, Aditi. Thank you. That's great. Yeah, I'll say just for starters, yes. The idea of an immanent totalization by a feminine modernities, that's kind of why I ended with that last slide. I'm trying to open it here to see it myself again. Yes, by Maria Bartuzova. Yes, so as a Derridian, like I remember like an interview with Derrida where they asked him about postmodernism, and he said something like, "Tell me when modernity ended, and then we'll talk about postmodernity." I don't deal with that term that much. I think postmodernity is a useful term in terms of art periodization and so on. It's for sure, but in what I'm trying to explain, yes, like I think I'm precisely trying to see, precisely because modernity has this desire for immanent totalization that needs to exclude the feminine, right? I'm trying to see where can we see it and how far back can we start tracing this detotalization by the actual non-exclusion of the feminine, right? My big question that I'm just starting to develop here is sovereignty as we understand it, and mostly personal sovereignty, or the idea of the total subject, is it possible to be thought within this new scheme, right? Like that was kind of what I was trying to do with that weird leap that I did into our Twitter feed, showing like, a little bit of that tiresome repetitiveness about the crisis of masculinity that we keep seeing, right? That is like really affecting so many people, right? And it's spreading like a horrible virus in a lot of places, right? So I'm kind of trying to go back and say like, okay, so if we had that struggle in modernity, right, and it was clearly this struggle to completeness through the exclusion of the feminine, or what we consider the feminine, right? Was the other impulse also there, and how much can we take it and see it into a new modernity, right? Like, so maybe a post-modernity, but not in the sense of Jameson and other post-modernities, but in the sense of a different kind of modernity that has to do precisely with gender. That will be my bet, but I'm work in progress. Thank you. Excited to see your piece in the Badu book as well. I think there's a hand raised as well there.
Thank you. Yeah, Debojyoti, could you please ask your
question? Yeah. Since it was talking about the totality, I would just ask him one particular question about the conclusion of 120 Days of Sodom, where he concludes by saying, "Oh, virtue," he would sometimes exclaim, "perhaps it was essential that all these things happen thus in order to bring Oxyrian back to thy temple. If that be true, then my heart takes comfort in the thought, for I alone have suffered from the crimes he committed, while his good deeds redound to the benefit of all." So here, this I and all, this virtue and the crime. Can you please tell me about this? How this from movement from individuality to the totality takes place in the last conclusion of 120 Days of Sodom?
Thank you, Aujourd'hui. That's a fantastic question. I wish I had my book right now. I left it at home. I mean, I think so. Annie Lebrun has this fantastic book on Saad called Soudain l'abîme. I think Soudain l'abîme s'ouvre, which is what I was quoting. And she, part of her thesis, which is very interesting, is that the reason we have not understood Saad, and she criticizes all of the classical like readings of Saad, right? Like Blanchot, Barthes, Bataille, and so on. And her view is that we don't understand Saad's loneliness, Saad's isolation. Her view and her reading of not only the 120 Days of Sodom, but of all the work is precisely that the ethics, if you want to call them that, of Saad at the end, that totalitarian impulse, is what it creates is just this absolute isolated subject, right? Like, so a monad without any other more monads, right? So in your question, and I'm quoting that still kind of beautiful ending to the book, right? In your question about totalitarian individualism, I think precisely that is the question, the problem. The problem is that a totalitarian impulse, like think of, not to get too political right now, but think about like Vladimir Putin right now. A totalitarian impulse, what it's going to create at the end is an absolute isolation of the subject, right? Like in a sense, a pure individuum, right, that considers itself without rest, right, without a wound, without any access to the other, what is other, right? So, and I think that's like that's kind of part of what some critics will say. You know, the 120 Days of Sodom, which is this like in a spooky way beautiful description of totalitarian impulse, right? And it's like, you know, the castle isolated by like the bridge is broken, there is a gulf, there is like, you know, the weather is also like helps to isolate it, right? It's precisely this attempt to or display of an absolute isolated individual in this impulse, right? Like it is the totally related in the sense of at the end, you know, it wants to be, if only in imagination, an absolute sovereign, an absolute individual, right?
And sir,
Like
that is why he equated virtue with crime, right? So that it becomes total, right? Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks to you.
I think we have run out of time, and we got a bit delayed to start with. And I know James has been very gracious to wake up early in the morning and do this for us. It's pretty early when we started in Arkansas time. So let me take this opportunity to thank James once more. It's wonderful to hear you as always, and I'm very happy that in spite of all the things we started with, we could manage without too much perversion at the end.
Thank you, Arka, and thank you everybody for coming. I really appreciate it. It was great seeing you and chatting with you all.
Thank you so much, and I hope we are able to do this in person sometime soon.
Yeah.
Okay. Bye-bye. Bye.